This is the 217 Recovery Podcast with Corey Winfield.
You know, they did me wrong. They did me dirty. They made me drink.
But I'm not a baby. I'm not a kid.
And co-host Marnie Winfield.
You know, you can be pretty sure that the decision that you made was the right one. God kind of paved the way for what was supposed to happen, I feel.
It is the 9th of October, 2022. My name's Corey Winfield, and this is the 217 Recovery Podcast. Marnie is writing a paper. She's not on today, but I do have a very special guest on with me today. Is Casey from Addiction in the Family. Casey, how's it going, man?
It's going great. Thanks for having me on the podcast. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being on. You, of course, have your own podcast, Addiction in the Family.
I do. I always have to be careful when I enunciate it, because when I say it, it sounds like Addiction in the Family.
Right.
Addiction and the Family. And yeah, it's something I started up about 2.5 years ago or so when I started writing my first book. And I was thinking, like, I'm getting pretty serious about writing this. And so I started looking at some publishers. And the publisher's like, well, what are you going to do to publicize the book? And I always thought, like, that was your job. But okay. So what am I going to do to publicize it? I thought I'll probably go do some interviews. And I went, oh, wait, no, actually what I need to do is, like, have my own podcast, be the host of, et cetera, et cetera. So that got that going. And I have a special passion professionally and personally for helping family members understand what recovery is about, not just understand what's going on with the person who has an addiction, but to understand their own recovery and get, like, hey, this is not about one person in the family's messed up and everyone else needs to rally around them or kick them out or whatever. Like, if you got better, we'd all be fine. But looking and saying, like, how does everybody get better through working on their own recovery? So that's what got that podcast going.
Yeah, I noticed when I said it, it kind of sounded like I said Addiction in the Family. But it's Addiction and the Family.
Do, which never crossed my mind when I put it out. Going back, I don't know what I would do exactly different, but either way, it is what it is.
For those up-and-comers, you know, pick the name carefully. But see, the problem with that, too, is it already taken? You know, like, you have to look and see. And
well, you know, it's true, because I thought about that, and there's a really sort of classic book in the field called Addict in the Family. And I kind of looked at that and went like, okay, well, I don't want to be like ripping off somebody else's title. So Addiction and the Family ended up being the thing. I just reminds me to enunciate. My mom would be proud.
Give me your background on recovery.
Well, so as far as my background in recovery, I'm the first person that I know of in my family to get into recovery, but I'm one of many, 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 many people in long branching story of family history. Two families. I have my birth family and my adoptive family. Both of them have addiction stuff going on. And so I was born into a family where addiction, I'm going to say, is much less acknowledged initially. I'm seeing kind of my generation, people saying, hey, you know what, maybe we need to get sober. I have an uncle who got sober towards the end of his life. And then both of his kids have looked at that and, you know, gone through recovery stuff. But previous to that, I'm not aware of anybody, and quite honestly, I had been in recovery for a long time before my uncle got into it. So in a way, I was sort of that vanguard of recovery within the family. But the addiction side, I mean, I hate to say it, it's just all over the place. And some of it's chemical stuff, some of it's sex and love addiction, some of it's, I'm sure, lots of other things, plenty of codependency, no doubt. And you know, everybody's kind of doing the best they can. And that's something that I've really seen in my work and in my own life, is that the effects of addiction, whether they show up in every family member, and typically they don't show up in every family member, and they don't even show up in every generation, but the effects of it get passed down from generation to generation to generation. And those family patterns that unfortunately end up being kind of ripe for addiction to blossom in the family again. Like, if somebody in the family starts showing with an addiction, everybody already knows how to not talk about it. Mm-hmm. Everybody already knows how to not express feelings, stuff like that. So I was born to a couple of people who have a lot of those signs around sex and love addiction. I always tell this story. I was sort of conceived in addiction. It was their very first date, first time they met each other. Boom, there we go, pregnant. That's me. And they had decided to get married, apparently before they found out I was pregnant. I found that out after I published my book. My birth father calls that, hey, just want to let you know, we had already decided we were going to get married. We weren't just getting married over you. I'm like, oh, that's very sweet. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. But at the same time, you know, from talking with them now when they look back, again, they were young, but they were very intellectual, very cerebral, not very emotional, connecty. Now, my birth mother has gone on to become a very empathetic, emotionally connected person. But that was not the family pattern in general. Again, the family pattern keeps getting passed down. A lot of people, when they deal with addiction, especially before recovery was really like an option for anybody, families just learned how to, we'll just learn how to shut down. We'll learn how to not feel it and how to talk about it, all that kind of thing. Don't let the neighbors know. Yeah. So I can see some of that may have shown up in the birth family for that reason, or possibly other reasons as well. So there I was for the first couple of years, kind of in that environment. And my birth mother would say today, like, yes, I can look back and see those signs of sex and love addiction you're talking about. My birth father's like, nah, I don't really see it. And I'm like, that's okay. That's his own thing. But I was adopted from that family into another family where my father had a serious drinking problem for all his life. And up until the last 2 years of his life, he got sober. Just on his own, 100% willpower, white knuckle, all that kind of stuff. And I didn't find that out till he'd been dead for about 10 years. And I remember asking my mom, like, wow, so Dad got sober. How was that for him, doing it on his own? And she goes, he was miserable. Yeah. And that's something that I really see is like, I mean, the science shows it, but personal experience shows it as well. People who get sober in a recovery fellowship with other people, twice as likely to get sober, but I'm going to say, I don't know, there's not really a statistic for this that I'm aware of, but exponentially more likely to be happy when they do it and to feel good about themselves, see their lives getting better, not just, I am not going to do this thing, which in this case meant like basically firing all his friends, but not really developing new ones, feeling isolated, and I'm sure just feeling miserable from all the emotional pressure that he no longer had his favorite escape from. So right around the time that he was getting sober, within a year or two of that, I started into recovery myself. And I had been married 10 years at that point. I had a 2-year-old. I had sort of some of those stereotypes that we hear in some of the recovery fellowships. I had, a house and a job and a wife, kid, dog, 2 cars in the driveway, picket fence. I mean, literally all those things. And I was starting to really recognize that all that stuff was going to disappear. And not only was it going to go away, it was going to go away directly because of my own actions, the stuff that I was doing in my addiction while I never got caught, per se. The cracks were starting to show. People were starting to talk, all this sort of stuff. And I think partly because of my experiences with the adoption, my fear of abandonment, all that kind of stuff, I like to say I don't have any character defects that my higher power can't put to good use. Well, this was a way of using all of that abandonment, fear, and all that kind of stuff put to good use because I looked at the idea that I might lose everything, might especially lose my family. And I just went like, whoa, no, that can't happen. What else do I need to do? Well, that went hand in hand with starting with a new therapist. And this new therapist who I originally saw, I mean, it's really just, I was going to say a funny story, but maybe like a bonehead story. I went to go see the therapist to figure out how to be better at my addiction. Literally, I was going in to say, in this case, how can I have affairs on my wife but not upset her so much that she leaves me? Like, how can we kind of find this balance where everybody's okay? And that's, I mean, in my head, that's literally what I want. I was thinking, like, everybody's going to learn to be okay with this. This was my addictive thinking. And the therapist in the first few minutes is like, so this might be addiction. And, and at the time she said, have you ever heard of sex addiction? And I'm like, no, I have not. But as soon as she said it out loud, like my stomach dropped. I'm like, oh. Well, on the one hand, is hey, cool, there's a name for this thing that goes on in my head and my behavior. On the other hand, I had hung out with people who like had at least at one point or another in their lives been in recovery from addiction. I wasn't hanging out with a ton of people who were active in recovery, some, but not a ton because that wasn't my vibe. But I had been around it long enough to go like, doesn't that mean you have to go like meetings for the rest of your life and do all these things? And this might not actually be good. On the other hand, there's a name for it and there might be a solution and maybe I'm not going to lose the whole family. Which, fast forward, that's what happened. I didn't lose the whole family. I didn't lose everything. I struggled for the first, I'm going to say about 7 years or so in recovery because I didn't want to do all the things we suggested, especially the spiritual stuff. Recovery fellowships I were going to were all about, hey, there's a spiritual solution and that's what you should do. And I'm like, yeah, that's not me. You guys go ahead. You've got this set of suggestions that I should follow, and about half of them say God or higher power or something like that. So I'm not doing those. So I'll do the other half, So I struggled for a few years because it turns out that was not enough to maintain continuous sobriety. I could be sober for a stretch, 6 months, year and a half even, kind of white knuckling, kind of, I guess, like my dad did. Not totally miserable, still going to the meetings, still life getting better, cut out the main behaviors that were screwing my life up. But not enough to really get all the way there. And so I finally ended up having to wave the white flag and say, okay, I'm willing to do all the things you suggest. You tell me to do it, I'm going to do it. And one of my sponsors in the program said, so you ready to start praying? I'm like, okay, yes. It's got to be better than what I'm doing now. So it's something I talk about in the book that I published recently, Spirituality for People Who Hate Spirituality. I tell the story in there. I got on my knees and I started praying, and I was absolutely certain there is nothing that I'm talking to. Like, I'm being really, really foolish. But on the other hand, I did all kinds of foolish things in the name of my addiction. So I'll do some foolish things in the name of my recovery. Let's see what happens. And that started me on my spiritual journey, and that started me towards the path of being able to maintain continuous sobriety over the last 16, going on 17 years now.
Nice. Well, congratulations on that. That's a pretty long time. And when I talk to people, I'm like, I'm coming up on 4 years. I only have like 3 years and some months, and they're just like, only, but
that's amazing, dude. It's a miracle. Hey, with somebody with an addiction has 24 hours, that's a miracle.
Yeah. And
I didn't used to be able to do 24 hours in a row. So all of this is a miracle.
At one point you had 1,396 days too. At one point we had day 2. You gotta build on it, and that's what I kind of tell the guys. But yeah, when I look at it, like, only because I remember when I thought I would never get a year, that only happens to those other people. And when it always starts happening and you're putting it together, there's a huge difference. You had mentioned, white knuckling it and being sober versus being in recovery, active in recovery, and doing all the things that you're required to do. And you think, oh, we're kind of required to do. What do you mean? It's good things, but change people don't like. And when you want to pick and choose your own ways to do it, like you had mentioned, you're kind of half-assing it, kind of in, kind of out, but you were picking and choosing what you wanted to do. But until you saw the white flag and started raising it, saying, you know what, let me just try it. And then you realize, wow, why was I fighting that so hard? This is actually twice as good, and I feel better. Everything in my life is changing. This is great. It's like, I compare, like, if you're going on a diet. Oh, I can't eat ice cream. Oh, I can't eat that. That to me is like, oh, I'm just going to be sober. I'm just not going to use. What are you replacing it with? Well, I'm in recovery now. I replace all that stuff with all the stuff I do in recovery. Same thing if you're on a diet. Don't call it a diet. Say you're eating healthy. Enjoy eating healthy. And it changes the mindset, and it's a totally different experience. My wife, she likes to keep me fat. So she makes these delicious pies in apple season. So we got apple pies flowing around the house. I got cookies. She's a chubby chaser. I don't know, but I like to eat, so it's good. But there'll come a point where I'm like, all right, I got to start eating healthy again. But then she goes on that kick with me too, and it makes it a lot more enjoyable. But if I just walked out today and said, hey, honey, we're doing chicken and we're doing broccoli and rice, she'd be like, hell yeah. And if I looked at it like that, like, hey, I'm going to eat healthy, for the next 2 weeks, not for the rest of my life, just the next 2 weeks, I'm going to get healthy. And then I start feeling better. And then my pants start getting a little looser and my shirts start, a little looser. And I'm like, okay, I'm seeing the results. A lot of times I think people, when they get out of treatment, they're, all right, I'm going to do 90 and 90. And then they kind of mess that up, don't follow through. Or maybe they are, maybe they're hitting them, but they're not actually getting what they need out of the meetings. But they get out and they hit the ground and they're hardcore with it, and they don't see those instant results. Well, I still don't have a job. I'm still living with my mom. I still, can't get my car back. And then they give up, and it's the same thing again with the diet, eating healthy thing. If I start eating healthy today, I'm not going to drop down to 195, that's not going to happen today. In 2-3 years, if I would have started when I started the sobriety kick, when I started my journey in recovery, I'd be 4 years eating healthy. I'd be pretty all right. I'd probably be out walking. I'd be feeling a lot better. But it's just one of those things where it's one thing at a time. and I know what I need to do. If I don't like the way my clothes are fitting, well, here's what I can do to change it. So that's kind of my approach on the whole diet eating and is being sober versus being in recovery. Now, you had mentioned earlier, Casey, that you have written books. You put an S on it.
Yeah, it's really fun. I set out, I went back to school some years back because one of my managers suggested it. Said like, hey, you should go back to school. I was working at a treatment center, and they said, you should go back to school. We think you make a good counselor. And I was like, I've been to a lot of school. I got no degrees to show for it, got no letters after my name. I don't know, man. Honestly, the track record is that I spend a lot of money and time, and then I drop out for one reason or another. Not all addiction related, but all impacted by that. And they said the magic words are like, well, we'll pay for half. I'm like, okay, now I really have to do this. But my grand design was, I'm going to get an associate's degree. And that just sounded like amazing. I could have a college degree. And on that basis, I could get, in the state I was living in, New Mexico at the time, I could get this provisional counseling license. And you do a couple years of work under supervision, and then you get your full license. And I'm like, all right. I'm in recovery now. Things are going pretty well. They're humming along. I can do this. So set out to do it, did that, got my bachelor's, ended up getting my master's degree, never would have thought. I went back to get my master's degree actually so that I could move up into management. And about halfway through the degree, I realized I don't want to be in management. I like working directly with people and with families. And it was kind of like, hey, we could move you up to this position or that position, but you're not going to run the family workshop anymore. And we're going to have to cut you because, like you really might not be seeing, maybe every once in a while you see a client. And I'm like, oh man, I don't know that I want that. Like, even if it's more money, I don't know that that's what I want to do. So finished up my degree, and I'm kind of like, and I told my wife at one point, like, I think when I finish my degree, I'm probably going to write a book. And that was like the goal, like a book. What's it going to be about? I don't know. It's the idea of writing a book, right? So fast forward a couple years after I finished the degree, because it turns out there's a lot of writing and getting the degree. By then I was like, okay, I'm done. But eventually I was like, okay, maybe it's time to write a book. I'm not sure what to write about. Well, in the meantime, I've been conducting family workshops every weekend, year in, year out. And I realized, one day I sit down and do the math, and I realized I've done like hundreds of family workshops. I've worked with thousands of family members, let alone I can't even count how many people who are seeking addiction through a treatment center or outside through the recovery fellowships who I work with, just where I look around and go like, well, I've worked with a lot of people around recovery, a lot of families. Why am I not writing that book? So I looked around to see, like, has anyone else written like a really solid book for family members? And not again, poo-pooing it, but almost everything I could find was like memoirs. Like that book, Addict in the Family. Great book, but it's basically a series of sort of essays or first-person accounts of family members, what it was like to have someone addicted in their family. A lot of the books are kind of like, my son's journey through recovery or through addiction. Here's what I went through with my brother or that kind of thing. There wasn't a whole lot out there just saying, here's a hands-on manual, like what you do if you have someone who's addicted, what you can do, what you can't do, what addiction is, what it isn't, what does it look like in treatment? Like I'm sending my person off into this black box. Like, what should I expect to have happen there? How do I talk to them? How do we communicate? What do I do afterwards? What should I expect? And how can I be happy? Because I think a lot of times that's the end goal. If people think like any human being, I want to be happy. There's just an assumption I can only do that if my loved one gets sober. So I took all of that stuff that I'd done through doing all these family workshops, through being in recovery fellowships that are for family members, which if there's any family members out there listening, there are recovery fellowships started for and by people like you. Things like Al-Anon, Smart Recovery Family and Friends, Nar-Anon. There's a ton of fellowships out there. Most of them are 12-step based. Smart Recovery is not. There's options for you to find recovery as a family member. And I thought, I want to have this sort of clearinghouse book in plain language that people can read. And so I set out to write that book. And it took a couple years. So I put that out actually it's just about a year ago now, so October of 21, put the book out. And I kind of thought okay, now I've got a book. What do you do? Well, now, it's like we said, you got to pound the pavement, do the podcast, get out there, let people know this book exists. And it's done okay. But what really surprised me is as soon as I finished the first book, this title pops in my head. Spirituality for People Who Hate Spirituality, a primer. And I'm like, that's a funny title. And I'm kind of tucking it away in the back of my mind. I'm thinking is that going to be like book number 2? So yeah, so I started writing that at the same time. So I'm kind of pounding the pavement on the first one, letting people know it exists, and then started writing the second one. I wasn't really sure. Like, I was thinking, like, how much do I have to say about this? Maybe I always joked with my wife, maybe it'll just be a pamphlet. I don't know. It'll be a postcard. Like, flip it over the back. Here's the second half of the message. But I found, like all these things, I've got my own personal experience, what I've learned through working with other people, and then being the research geek that I am, I started, of course, doing research, because any of these books that I'm writing, I want there to be like footnotes. I want there to be studies you can reference where you can flip to the back of the book and say, like, so he's saying that, but where does he get this idea? And you can flip to the back. There's going to be a reference section, and it's going to say, here's this study. And I try and make sure all the research, unless there's a really good reason, like an older study that you just got to be able to reference, pretty much all the research is within 5 years of the time I'm writing the book. So it's all pretty recent stuff. And I got to writing that. And of course, as I'm researching, I'm learning stuff and think, oh, well, now I got to put that in the book. And I'd set out to, look up a study on one thing, and then I'd see some study title about something else that pops up under the search results. I'm like, huh. Like one that is in the book talks about this Japanese practice of forest bathing. And I'm like, forest bathing? Like taking a bath in the forest? Like, what is this? So I start reading it, and it's actually forest bathing used in the same way that people say sunbathing. Like bathing yourself in the energy of the forest. And sometimes people will get a prescription, from what I'm understanding in this. And this study was tracking the results of this, and turns out positive results from somebody getting a prescription saying you basically are not getting enough time in this kind of environment. So part of your health care is going to be taking walks in the forest, presumably on safe trails and all this kind of stuff, but just soaking up. I mean, you can imagine, the oxygen, the vibe, the peace, all those kinds of things that you could point out individually and say, like, that totally makes sense, but somebody thought to put it all together and call it a thing. So all this stuff that I learned in writing the book. So yeah, I got the second book out, and I kid you not, the day I finished the formatting for the second book, the title for the third book popped in my head, and I'm like, okay, I was seriously going to take a break, but my higher powers got some other idea. Boom, here's this thing in my head, and I'm like, okay, we'll write that book. And then based on a conversation so I'm in the process of writing that one. That one's kind of early stages. I've got it outlined, and I'm working through it. And I'm part of a book marketing group, like self-published authors learning marketing together kind of thing, exchanging ideas. Hey, you should go to this library, or this person's looking for someone to speak, all that kind of thing. And one of them mentioned at our last meeting, just last month, said, hey, children's books are really hot right now. And I was thinking, like, doing what I do, what kind of children's book would I write? Like, Mommy drinks too much? But the actual title popped in my head the next day, and I went like, oh, yeah. So I sat down, and I looked up some stuff on children's books. I've never done that. And it turns out average children's book should be about 24 pages or so, is sort of the gold standard. So I thought, okay, so I basically need to come up with 24 sentences. If I can write 2 full books and I'm working on a third one, I can write 24 sentences. And I just kind of let that flow, based again on things that I've heard family members say, things I've heard from kids in the family workshop, my own experience growing up around it, all that stuff. And so I actually just met with the illustrator a couple nights ago to kind of say, hey, here's some character sketches, here's what we're thinking. Started talking about terms, and hopefully, I don't know how long such things take, but I'll probably say in the next few months we'll have a children's book out. So all of a sudden I went from a guy who was thinking, gosh, what would it be like to write a book, to like, now I've got 2 out and 2 more in process. It's kind of amazing. So these are the miracles that happen around recovery in my life, and the kind of things that I see happen for people. Going from someone who was afraid to pray because it was stupid to writing a book on spirituality, to having several books. And yes, it is a lot of fun when somebody says, hey, I'm reading your book, and I get to say, oh, cool, which one?
Yeah.
That's all ego, but it's fun.
I got something for the kids coming out eventually.
That's right.
But yeah, that's sweet. And just having goals, having something that you're chasing after, that for me was huge. It was a sense of purpose. And what do I want to do? And then you realize, well, I'm sober. I'm in recovery. I can do whatever I want to do. Especially nowadays with the internet. Well, how do I write a book? Well, I don't know. Let me Google it. I mean, it's probably a little harder than that, but you can learn how to do it. Just because you don't know how to do it right now at this moment doesn't mean you can't obtain it. And it might take a year. It might take 2 years. But to actually do that, and I guarantee you your answer to this is going to be like, I'd still do it. If not one person bought your book, you'd still do it. You know, it wasn't about like,
There's something to be said for just the process and how much I learned in writing it. And even, writing my first book, Realistic Hope, the one for families, even that one, same sort of thing, lots and lots of research. And sometimes, admittedly, I'm thinking, okay, I know this thing is true. Let me go find a study that just says like, yep, rubber stamp, we agree with Casey, it's true. But then there's other stuff where I'd go like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. So I learn so much more about a subject. But of course, it's gratifying to see the work get out there and see people buy it or go like, oh, hey, your book was really helpful, stuff like that. That kind of thing, of course, is beautiful. But yeah, it's worth doing for its own sake, without a doubt.
Just to do something you said you were going to do. You put your mind to it, and that inspires a lot of people. That inspires me, to see people like you, like making it, and you have 4 times as much clean time as I have, but it makes me look at like, wow, when I have 16 years, like what will I be doing? And everybody kind of wants to write a book. The people in recovery, we all have crazy stories, but your books are different. And I like the fact that they help people and families, man. They need it so much. And now is the time, I think, things are changing. People aren't keeping it in the basement anymore, where, oh, don't tell the neighbors. Don't. Well, if you talk to your neighbor, maybe they're going through the same thing, and maybe, they can offer up some things. And, that's what those meetings are so powerful when family members come together and they talk to each other, because there's a line between helping and enabling. And if someone's in active addiction, they'll say whatever, they'll avoid you. We'll do whatever we have to do to justify it in our mind that we didn't do anything bad. Meanwhile, we're lying right to our moms, dads, sisters, brothers, because that's how addiction works. It takes over our brain, and that's the only thing that we can think of. That's the only thing we want that can make us happy, that can take us away from however we're feeling, that feeling of dread or abandonment. I didn't even realize that I was going through abandonment issues, and you mentioned that earlier that you did too. I thought I was a man. I should just get over that, but to actually break it down and go, no, that's a huge issue, and to not just jump right in to tackle it right away, but I always tell people, like, there's a closet in my head where I just put things that I'm going to get to that when I have some good clean time, when I have some good grounding underneath me, because if I try to tackle that too quickly, it's just going to all blow up in my face. And if I don't get the results that I'm wanting, might turn right back to drinking again. And I don't want to do that. So let me put that up there. Let me get some foundation first, and then I can tackle that. And you deal with families a lot. How often would you say, in a percentage, does codependency pop up?
Now, that's an interesting thing, because one of the things with codependency is that it doesn't really have a clear definition. Like, you can't be diagnosed with codependency. Insurance companies are not going to cover for codependency. It's not really considered to be like a psychological or psychiatric condition. That being said, you can pay good money to go to codependency treatment. So it's a term that gets thrown around a lot. There's a couple of classic books in the field like Codependent No More or Facing Codependency, things like that are excellent books. And they'll each kind of have their own spin on what it really is. The definition that I've gone with, and I put this in Realistic Hope, my first book, is co means with, and dependency in this case, I'm going to say like chemical dependency or dependency on some compulsive behavior. So what is the set or constellation of behaviors and attitudes and feelings that we see go with somebody who is living with somebody else that has some kind of dependency? Now, other people might say codependency, the with dependency would be like we're each of us is super dependent on the other one. There's different ways to look at it. I kind of go with that one because, first of all, it really brings the focus back to addiction, and it goes back to that family pattern thing that I was talking about, which is this idea that probably somewhere way generations back, whoever it is that first developed an addiction in the family, way before there were recovery fellowships or anything that could be done about it, it was going to be a secret. Because to reveal it was just to reveal that your family's doomed. And I'm going to say, quite honestly, there's in fact, there's even pushback on the term, because women are much more likely to get diagnosed, so to speak, with codependency, or told they're being codependent. Not exclusively, but statistically far more likely to be told that. And me being a social worker, I'm going to look back in time and say, what was the environment? Well, the environment was the man, who men are more likely to become addicted. He's getting addicted. Our whole family relies on his income. If you're a woman, there's not a lot of options. You can't just like divorce the dude and take off. In fact, for a long time in a lot of societies, and some still, I believe, a woman can't initiate divorce. A man can, a woman can't. So if you're a woman, your husband's addicted, it's like, what am I going to do? So can't really fight it, or I can try, but it's not going to get very far. So maybe I'm going to learn to pretend like things are okay. Maybe I'm going to learn to go along to get along. Maybe I'm going to learn to smile for the neighbors while I'm crying inside. Maybe I'm going to learn to do everything I possibly can to try and prop him up, even if it's self-destructive to me. I might do it for the kids. I might just do it because there's no other choice. But what often happens in families is I'm going to do it because I saw some of that modeled as a child myself. Because you're going to see a lot of people who have addiction in their family end up, quote unquote, connecting with other people who have a background of addiction in their family. Just because those grew up around these certain things, certain family patterns. It's going to be the look in somebody's eye, body language, tone of voice. We're not going to think, oh, wow, there's somebody else that's been through addiction in their family 10 generations past. We don't know what it is consciously, but subconsciously, that's what we're drawn to in people. You know, there's a little bit of it, like relatively small amount of what we're attracted to in somebody is actually their looks, because most of what we think of their looks is actually their choices. So here we are, families coming together, you know, choices of what do I wear, how do I style myself, what is my tone of voice, what is the look in my eyes, what is the kind of thing, what's my laugh like? These are all choices, conscious or unconscious. They're not genetically programmed things that are fate. So putting all this together, we have all these family members who are sort of family culturally used to being around other people who struggle with addiction. They may find other partners who actively struggle with addiction. They may fall into it themselves, all that kind of stuff. And these patterns just intermesh. So we meet somebody that has an addiction or high potential for addiction. We don't know why we find them attractive. And I'm saying this as a guy who's been married for 33 years now to somebody else who now happily in recovery, but first 10 years of our marriage, we were in active addiction with no idea. We didn't think we were addicted. I had sex addiction going on. She had food addiction going on. We had all kinds of what you might call codependency. I figured out years after I got into recovery around sex and love addiction that I also needed to stop drinking. I should probably go to a family fellowship, and now I'm in a fellowship for money. And now I'm in a subset of that for business money, bringing recovery into that stuff because publishing the books. So with all this stuff, my wife and I, will totally refer to ourselves in our early years as being very codependent without really having a super clear idea of exactly what that word means. So do I run into those behaviors, constellations? Do I even teach codependency? Yeah, I did a whole podcast episode on codependency, on addiction and the family, because it's a term that gets used so much. People throw it around. It's like, well, we may as well give it some kind of framework and say, okay, for one thing, you as a family member are probably doing a lot of the same things that your addicted loved one does. They look different. Like, we could look at our addicted loved one or ourselves in our addiction and go like, wow, that's a lot of dishonesty. Like, how can they be so dishonest? And I turn to family members and say, well, where are you dishonest? They're like, what, me? I don't lie about stuff. I said, are you sure? Because you keep pretending like you're okay with what your loved one does. Well, I don't want to upset them because and that's dishonesty. Did you ever walk on eggshells? That's dishonesty. You want to get really tricky? That's manipulation. You were walking on eggshells so that they don't get upset, so that they don't relapse, so you can be okay. It's like one of those old Rube Goldberg devices. Like, I'll push this lever, which will push that button, which get the mouse to run, and then on the treadmill, it's like you're doing this really complicated thing, all trying to control someone else without it ever crossing your mind that you're being dishonest for a second. So a lot of times family members fall into justification, rationalization, dishonesty, denial, all these kinds of things that we look at around addiction, we'll see in the family members in parallel showing up in different ways. And so that stuff, when we put it together, that's what I call codependency.
Yeah, I had some issues with codependency and I didn't even realize it, and then I look at it and you can call it manipulation, but like you said, there's no real clear cut. But there's a fact that my decisions, my choices, which were bad, were based off of, oh well, so and so will help. I don't have to do it. I don't have to do this what I need to do because so and so will help. And I've just now recently come to this point. You probably came to this point a long time ago too. But I start looking at those relationships from the past that were just absolutely horrible. That my sister didn't like her. My mom hated her. Like all these things. And there were red flags everywhere. And I was just catching them and throwing them down to the ground going, oh, no, that wasn't over here. And the same thing I think about with my drinking. People were saying it. See, oh, no. I had this protective shield around the bottle, and I had this protective shield around these horrible relationships that I was in. Well, at least one of them was really horrible. I'm not saying every relationship I was ever in was horrible, and it was ultimately my fault anyway, but that's how things had to work out for me to be with my wife today. But we protect, those people, those things that are bad for us, and we'll fight till I won't talk to my mom because she doesn't like so-and-so. I'm not going to talk to her then. She's going to have to learn to understand my choices. And then the relationship goes south, whatever. And then something new replaces it. And then I look back and go, why in the hell was I fighting so hard? She was horrible. She wasn't even hot, or not that has anything to do with it. I mean, inside she wasn't hot, she wasn't a good person. Nothing was good about it. And I'm just thinking, why did I stay with her for so long? And the same thing goes with drinking or, people's drug of choice. We fight to the bitter end to hold on to that, but I want to drink today. And damn it, I'm a grown ass. I mean, we'll justify the hell out of it of why we can't just let go, but then you let go. And once I accepted that, I can never do drugs again the rest of my life. Can't do it. It was just so freeing. Like going to AA before I started the podcast. I was in radio for 20 years and I sure as hell wasn't going to crack the mic and be like, Rock 107 WIRX, what's up? My name's Corey. I'm in recovery. Never was I going to do that. And going to AA meetings, oh, don't tell nobody you're here kind of thing, like going in, looking around. All right, is anybody looking? All right, let's go in. Yep, I'm just here dropping off cookies, not my meeting. If I had it all lined out, if I walked in and saw somebody I knew or something, this isn't is Bob here? So when I started the podcast and I was like, boom, I'm doing it. And it was so freeing. Like, hey, I'm in recovery. It's out there. What's up? It wasn't hiding anymore. It's letting go of those things that we're holding on to for no reason whatsoever. The addiction, the relationships. And I don't know why our brain does that. Just maybe because we're afraid of change. We don't want to feel like a failure. Growing up, just in society, you're taught alcoholics are just bad people, man. They beat their wives, can't hold jobs, kill people in accidents. They're just bad people. I had a job, I had a house, nice car. I wasn't beating anybody up. I just would go home and drink myself to death pretty much. But I wasn't a bad person, and I didn't want to be labeled like that. And I think it's in time, I think it'll get better. People with a different drug of choice that take heroin, like, oh, them junkies, what you see in movies and what you see on TV, it would shock people if they knew junkies were their coworkers and they had no idea. Not everybody's there shooting up, passing out. That's not how that works most of the time. And they would just be shocked, that these people aren't using anymore to get high. These people are using to just try to function, to go through the day. And it was the same with me drinking, where I would start shaking about 2:00 and then it got to like noon. I'd start shaking. My boss would be like, hey, let's go to lunch. And I was afraid to order anything. So I'd just sit there and I would keep my hands under the table. And I remember one time I reached for my water and my hands were shaking so bad. My boss just looked at me and was like, are you all right? And I would always blame medication. Oh yeah, I ran out of my blood pressure medication. I'm good, man. And meanwhile, I'm just sitting there, probably just smell like brewery, or liquor farm. And I just wish, though, at the time I could have just looked at him and said, no, man, I'm not all right. The only thing that stops this is me drinking more. Like when I would get home, I would slam liquor, and it wasn't to get a buzz. It was to stop the shaking, to stop the pins and needles. And then I'd be like, oh, I would take a deep breath after, about 10 minutes or whatever of chugging. And then I would feel normal. And I'd be like, okay, now I can function. And I knew that was hell. I didn't want to be that. I didn't want to be labeled alcoholic either, but I didn't know what to do about it. And I thought going to treatment was ridiculous. I don't need that. And it's funny how a lot of the stories with different people are pretty much the same. When I had a house and I had a nice car, I had a good job, and then you start losing those things, and I was in the hospital for almost a month. My liver shut down, kidneys shut down. I couldn't hide it really anymore then. I still tried to pitch it off to it was the doctor's fault who gave me the wrong pill at work, and my boss was like, okay. I just assumed that everybody was dumb and didn't know really what was going on. iHeartMedia was a great company. They have dealt with this before. It's a large company. So they knew what to do. And when I told my boss at one point after I got out of the hospital, I was like, I need to go to rehab. And he said, good. Your job's going to be here, bro. Don't worry about that. Just go get better, man. And that was such a huge relief because I didn't know. I just thought, well, I guess I'm not getting paid for 3 months. I don't know how I'm going to afford my house and this and that. But FMLA papers, I had so much vacation time. I didn't even miss a paycheck. So like all those fears of all those reasons why I wouldn't, well, boss is going to fire me if I tell him I got a problem, or I'm going to miss some paychecks, and what can I do? And none of that even happened. But a lot of times it's hard for people to realize that. And that's one of the bigger things that I hear from people, or one of the main reasons why they can't go get help is, I got to work. I got to pay my house payment. I got to pay my car. And those are real worries. But have you looked into how much vacation time you do have? Have you looked into maybe slowing down, at least outpatient stuff? Not everybody has to go to inpatient. Getting that therapist was very important for me. One that you like, one that you trust. Not necessarily, I guess you have to like them, but there's a difference between liking them and just feeding them a line of BS and actually trusting them. So that kind of goes hand in hand too. But, using those people, and I say that I use a lot of people, and some people are like, what do you mean you use people? Well, I use people for what I need. I have, family members, I have my wife, I have friends, AA meetings, therapists, podcasts, like these are things that I do that as a whole, it makes me feel complete. And there's people that I can talk to now, and not being afraid to open up, I'm a man. I'm not supposed to have feelings like this. Well, when you get a year sober and you start talking to your mother and you just break down with happy tears and you can't control it, I call it quiver cheek. Like when I was getting married, like it was hard for me to say my vows, man. And I was afraid that I was going to get quiver cheek where you start crying and you can't control it, so I'm doing that stuff anyway. So I'm figuring, well, I can talk about my feelings. I can cry, and I don't know. I'm just rambling on now about being a man.
It's all good. Yeah, no, some of the stuff you hit in there is really cool. And I'm trying to think something that particularly jumped out. Yeah, well, it's back to that family pattern thing, right? Is being able to be in touch with our feelings. And I've run into a lot of people that were raised deliberately not to be in touch with their feelings. And that was something my dad would say. He's like, those people that talk about all their feelings and have to discuss every bowel movement. And I'm like, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about being able to to be real. And that was something that growing up hadn't crossed my mind. The idea that I could show up to a conversation, show up to a party, show up to a date, show up to anything as myself was terrifying. Because when you talk about like what makes it so hard for our brains to say like, hey, this isn't working for me, I should stop. There's a ton of like genetic, environmental factors and all this kind of stuff. And I'll take a moment. Can't help it. Shameless plug here. So if you go to the podcast, Addiction and the Family, episode 5 is about addiction in the brain. It's an hour-long lecture that I was actually giving to family members to explain, why is it so hard to give up? Why does my loved one do these things? What's the deal with this? And of course, I give the same presentation to the clients at the treatment center where I work as well, because it, not so much that you need to know the genetic factors and you need to know the environmental factors, and you need to know psychologically how you react and all that. You can get sober without knowing any of that stuff. But what it does when people start to understand what's actually happening is it removes shame and blame. And shame and blame aren't really good for keeping people sober. They're sometimes the impetus to get into recovery. Sometimes people feel really bad about themselves. I did. It's like, oh man, I can't believe I did all this stuff. I got to get into recovery. But it's not going to sustain it. In fact, over time, it's going to start to degrade your ability to stay sober. It's going to undermine it if you're still living with the shame. So the funny thing about the human brain also is that we love to fill in with conjecture where we don't have facts. So if we don't know why it is that we did what we did, we're going to make up stuff like maybe I'm a bad person or maybe I have no willpower. And I was talking with a client just the other day, and I said, talking about like, yeah, man, I didn't have the willpower before I came to treatment, but now, now maybe I do. I said, hold up a second. What kind of recovery are you working? Because where I work, Windmill Wellness Ranch, we offer smart recovery and 12-step recovery. Most people end up doing both, to be perfectly honest. They find that like they're very complementary. They're not competition, anything like that. Some people are all one, all the other. It was all 12-step recovery. I said, so I want you to go back and look at that 12-step recovery. What does it tell you about willpower? Because it's not telling you you're going to like, now that you know the facts and you have a little willpower, you're going to stay sober. It's going to tell you you got to surrender to a higher power. Now, if someone's doing smart recovery, I'd say, okay, let's do a cost-benefit analysis here. If you decide you can do, you can approach it from any angle you want. Let's do a little ABC on that and see if that stands up. The point being that at the end of the day, our brain is set up such that it wants to go back to what it knows.
Yep.
And it mistakes addiction for survival. It really does. And sometimes that's hard for people to wrap their head around it because logically it's not. But it's not the logical part of our brain that really gets sucked into addiction. It's below that part called the limbic system. And I'm not going to go too far down the rabbit hole there, but just enough to say that an older, more powerful part of our brain that is huge in how we make decisions, that's the part that gets hooked into addiction. And that part can't think more than about 45 seconds or so into the future. So it's not going to consider consequences. Our conscious mind, our logical mind, our part of our mind that looks ahead to consequences, that gets dragged along for the ride. So we will come up with beautiful logical reasons because our logical mind has become overrun, or some would say hijacked, by the limbic system. We'll talk about an amygdala hijack or a limbic hijack. When that happens, we become convinced that our survival literally depends on keeping our addiction going. And when people's survival feels threatened, they'll do just about anything. So we'll lie, we'll cheat, we'll steal. We will lie to ourselves first and foremost. This will be the last time I do this. It's going to be okay. It's going to work out this time. We may or may not say those things out loud, but many of us will say them to ourselves. And then as soon as we satisfy the addiction, a lot of us are horrified. People take that first drink and then sometimes right after the drink or sometimes the next morning, they're like, oh my God, how could I have done this? What's wrong with me? All this kind of stuff. Well, what's wrong with you is your logical mind got hijacked and then given control back. It's almost like somebody else takes over your body and then gives it back. And you look around like, it's like one of these movie premises where somebody's looking around and they got blood on their hands. What did I do? Well, similar sort of thing with addiction. And if we can understand why that's happening, then it's easier to say, oh, okay, yeah, I'm not a horrible person. I'm not a bad person trying to be good. I'm a sick person trying to be well. And luckily, there's some really well-developed techniques for you to get well. And our willpower is not applied to, I'm going to stay sober today. But we can apply it to smaller, easier things. We can apply our willpower to, I'm going to go to a meeting even though I don't feel like it. I'm going to pray even if I think it's stupid. I'm going to journal even though I don't know if I have anything to say. I'm going to meditate even though I can't hold still without squirming for more than 10 seconds. We can make those kind of decisions. I'm going to pick up the phone and call somebody who's supportive in recovery, which again is one of those big, easy to tag recovery factors. People that connect socially with other people who are trying to get sober do much better than people who aren't. Thus the popularity of recovery fellowships. So we can apply our willpower to the smaller, more manageable tasks, and they will lead to sobriety. In the same way that somebody can't just wake up in the morning, no matter what anyone says, and just decide to be happy. But we can decide to do lots of little things that add up to happiness. And of course, a lot of overlap, a little Venn diagram there between the things that help establish recovery and the things that help a human being feel happy and satisfied with their lives.
I always talk about brain versus the soul, but from what you just said, it's all the brain. The logical mind, I've always said, is the soul. I'm like, it's a battle between your brain and your soul, man, because of who we are. Most of us are good people. Not everybody in recovery is a good person. Not everybody in this world is a good person. But most of us are pretty good people. But we don't want to be that other person, and why did I take that drink? Why did I do that? Oh, I ruined everything, and when your logic mind comes in, I call that the soul. Of who we really are. And it's a battle between those two. And when you can start doing little things to move yourself forward, to not be in those situations. Like today, I can't be 195 pounds because I eat a chicken sandwich. It's the little things. I can take a shower. I can feel better about myself. I can set my fantasy football lineup, the best of my ability. Those are things that I can do to make myself happy, and I found that cooking breakfast for my wife is something I enjoy, and doing stuff for other people is something that was huge for me too. And helping out at the food bank, and once a week we go around and we go to the homeless shelters and we just help people. Hey, do you need a phone? Do you need to get on, you need food stamps, bridge card, do you got your insurance set up? Because a lot of people just assume that, oh, well, they're living down at the shelter, they're getting hooked up with all that stuff. No, they're not. You would think, oh, they got 18 people in there just helping people. No, they don't. And so we show up and we help people and we kind of fill in the gap. And yeah, we do have brochures and pamphlets for, hey, do you have a problem with substances? Are you high on meth right now? Like, can we get you some help there too? And here's the steps that you would need to take. Because again, you just assume, at least most people do, that, hey, they're at the shelter, they're being taken care of, but they're not. So we kind of go there to reach out. And I do that because it helps me. It's very selfish. Taking people to and from treatment is something that we do, and it's needed. Oh, sure, places can get a guy an Uber. That's not the same as having a recovery coach, taking a guy across state, 4-hour drive, and it's nonstop talking. There's this guy who works at a treatment center downstate. I ran into him a couple weeks ago, and he said, oh, I drive people sometimes. He's like, it's kind of boring. I was like, what? Kind of boring. He's like, yeah, normally they just sit in the back seat and just all quiet. And I just kind of smiled and said, you're not in recovery, are you? He said, no. Okay. Yeah, that explains it. Because I was mind blown at, for like, what do you mean you don't talk? Like, there's a million questions they have on their mind. They're going to treatment, maybe for the 5th time, maybe for the first time. What's this going to be like? What's that like? And wait, you're in recovery too? Like when they jump in the car, they have no idea they're about to hit like I don't want to call it therapy session because I'm not a therapist, but they're going to get this spiritual talk, out and they have no idea, when they jump in the car. And I took a lady home the other day and she was just like, wow, like, I'm so glad that you took me home, and she's like, I thought it was just going to be horrible. I thought we wouldn't talk and I didn't know, and we just talked the whole time. And just from my experience, there's things that I've been through. And then, if you can create a little inspiration and hope for them, especially if they just got out of treatment after 2 months and she might be facing jail time, but it's like one of those things like, hey, if you have to go to jail, there's a reason why God wants you there, like who are you supposed to talk to? Don't go in there and think, oh, F it, I'm going to give up, like go in there and do the best you can do, be the best person that you can be in there, but hopefully you don't have to go back, but just to kind of calm her down a little bit. And sometimes that's what it takes, just a little nudge or just a little bit of inspiration, a little bit of hope. I know that's what it took to get me kind of fired up and like, all right, I'll start this podcast and who cares what people think. And then when I actually go through and do it, and it's like, man, I feel so much better. And it just changes the game, man. It really does. A little hope and inspiration.
That's really cool. Well, you touched on something that is so important. Field of positive psychology, which I haven't gone and gotten a degree in positive psychology specifically, but I was really lucky to be mentored by a guy named Dr. Jason Powers, who's went out of his way, medical doctor, went back to school to get a master's in positive psychology, and he now runs a program called Positive Recovery. And his mission was to say, can I take the concepts of positive psychology, which is relatively newer branch of psychology, really started at the turn of this century, so a little over 20 years old now. Can I take those ideas and apply them specifically to addiction recovery? And I got to work with him for a while and kind of learn a lot of stuff from him, learn how to train others in it, stuff like that. So I put some of that stuff in Realistic Hope, the first book, but I also focused on it in the new book, Spirituality for People Who Hate Spirituality, because we want to look and say, like, okay, people talk about being happier with spirituality. What does that actually even mean? Like, is that quantifiable? Can you measure it? And it turns out you can. But their positive psychology kind of splits off happiness into 3 kind of major categories. And like everything, humans, we like to categorize things. Everything doesn't fit neatly in a box. But looking at these sort of 3 types of happiness can be helpful. And the first one is what we call peak experiences. And those are the ones that everyone thinks of as being happiness. You know, I went with my kid to Disneyland. I went whitewater rafting, did skydiving, birthday party, things like that. Things that are just like, wow, that was really cool. A lot of times in addiction, where it's almost like we start out trying to run from peak experience to peak experience to peak experience. Well, the problem is over time, those dull. Like, you can't just keep hitting the same peak over and over again. Your brain will acclimate to that. It's a process called hedonic adaptation, where we'll just get used to it and turn the volume down on it, and now it's not as cool as it used to be. And that's partly psychological, neurochemical, a lot of stuff behind that. But that's peak experiences. We all need some of those, but they are not all of happiness. The second type of happiness is what you would call like a flow experience. And that's a style of happiness where when we're in it, we're just into doing it for its own sake. It usually doesn't carry the same kind of like sort of peak high as a peak experience, but it lasts longer. So it's like a little bit more of a gentle happiness curve, lasts longer. A lot of times we're not worried about time. It's worth doing for its own sake. So things like music, sports, podcasting, you know, just whatever it is you're doing, gardening, something that you're doing when you're doing it, you're into it, but also typically there are things that help you feel like you're learning and growing. So as you're doing it, you feel like, hey, I'm getting a little bit better at this, a little bit better at this. Working out at the gym, you know. I'm not going, oh, my 15 minutes is up. It sounds like the time flew. So we all need that type of happiness. But the third type is the most powerful, and those are meaningful experiences. Those are experiences where we feel like we're connected to something larger than ourselves. We are giving of ourselves to something larger, typically without a lot of thought of reward or direct reward. Like, I'm not getting paid for this, that sort of thing. Like, I work at a treatment center as a therapist. People, it must be really rewarding. Well, it is, and it's gratifying work, but I can't mistake that for being purely of service because I know I'm getting a paycheck for it. And it's not going to be quite the same thing. I can try and blank all that out while I'm doing my work, and I do. But when I'm outside of the treatment center and somebody calls and says, hey, can I get some help? And I'm like, I'm not helping you as a therapist. I'm helping you as another guy in recovery. That feels like a purely service thing. Taking time out of my day. Like I said, all the kind of stuff you're talking about. Well, it turns out that service and spirituality are the two best ways, and they overlap a lot, to have meaningful experiences. And those lead us to feeling like we have meaning in life. And that's why people sometimes, they'll chase the money, the fame, the sparkly things, and then they look around, midlife crisis, and they're like, you know, we see them melt down in public. They're like, basically, this didn't do for me what I thought it was going to do because it didn't feel meaningful. Other people might do the same things and do it in a spirit of service, and then it feels meaningful. And it turns out we need to have that sense of meaning and purpose to be happy, to actually feel like I feel good about my life. So we do need some peak experiences. We need some of those flow experiences, but we definitely need the meaningful experiences. And if we have the meaningful experiences, we can get by with less of the others. Doesn't mean we have to, but we could. Whereas if all we have is peak experiences, but we don't have a sense of meaning, we can't sustain ourselves that way. And so the kind of stuff you're talking about is really important. And spirituality, again, is a way that we can find peak experiences, we can find flow experiences, we can find meaningful experiences. And luckily, recovery fellowships encourage activities that help people have all three of those. Peak experiences might be saying like, yeah, man, I got 4 years sober. You know, that moment, that day, waking up in the morning, go like, oh my God, I did it. Or going to a meeting and, you know, picking up my 4-year chip and, you know, everybody claps and tell us how you did it. That can be a peak experience. The flow experience can be when you're working on your recovery work, when you're working with another person and you're just not thinking about the time going by, you're just into it. And then, of course, the meaningful experiences are all those times that you get to be of service, pass it on to the next person. And relating to something you said near the beginning of this podcast, you were talking about, you know, I feel like I have only, 3.5 years or whatever. And it's like, but somebody with 3.5 months is like in awe. But one of my favorite AA stories, and this was out of the AA Grapevine, which people aren't familiar with that. It's a magazine they put out called like their meeting in print. And there's a lot of anecdotes and stories and articles. And sometimes just those little like 2 or 3 paragraph stories are some of the best. And in one of them, there was a guy saying like, yeah, I had like 2 weeks sober. And my sponsor said, hey, we want you to come along on a 12-step call. We're going to go talk to a guy who needs to get sober. And a couple of us are going to go. Don't say anything. You just kind of go along for the ride to see how this is done. So sponsor's got 2 years sober. Guy going along with him's got 1 year sober. And our guy writing the story's got like 2 weeks sober. So they go to meet this fourth guy, talk to him. And later, that guy they were talking to said, well, the first guy said he had 2 years sober. So I figured he was lying. That's impossible. Some guy once said 1 year sober. I thought maybe, but I'm not sure. But that guy that had 2 weeks sober, I could hear what he had to say because I was thinking, man, maybe I could get 2 weeks sober. So you never know, whatever time you have, how much meaning you might have for somebody else in their life and how much that'll lift up both of you just to try that. And that's, of course, one of the huge, bases of 12-step recovery is based on that idea of one person reaching out to another person. They say, nothing ensures immunity against the next drink so much as working with another person. So that sense of service shows up and spirituality shows up in recovery, and it's a central part of having a happy, meaningful life.
Yeah, there's that thought of, okay, when I have 16 years sober and I need to talk to the guy who's trying to get 2 days, is he going to look at me different? And that's why I try to bring other people into, our organization, 217 Recovery. A lot of people say, hey, man, I want to start a podcast, and I will help them. I will. But it's hard when you take people sometimes. And this one guy I was kind of trying to take under my wing, and he's still there. He's just out doing he's got to figure it out himself. There's nothing we can do. I can't be sober for him, but I haven't shut him out of my life. I'm here. When the phone rings, I'll answer it. But right now, this is kind of like one of those things. But he went through treatment, and he's like, oh, yeah, man, I figured it out. I went to treatment once, and I figured it out. When he said that to me, I just kind of, internally, it was just like, oh, he's at that point. Oh, he's got a long way to go, and it's refreshing for me. Not refreshing, but it's a reminder for me to just know, like, hey, one drink, I'll be right back there too, to go through all that pain and misery again. I'd rather not. But he's got to. That's his journey. I had to. I went to treatment 15 times. That's a lot. I don't know how many he'll have to, but it's not looking good for him at this moment because he's making those choices that aren't lining up with what he's saying that he wants to do. Does he really want to do that? I think he does. But it's addiction. And, once you start making a bad choice, it's easy to keep making those bad choices. But my point, though, is to keep bringing those people along because those are the next generation. And I only have, coming up on 4 years in December, but those new people, they're so important, to talk to those people who have 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and they're doing stuff with me and my organization. Hell yeah, they are, because I want to give them a chance. I want to give them, some inspiration, some hope, give them that sense of purpose that I get from helping other people. And, it's one of those things where, it'll happen when it happens, but I can't not want those people involved with me. There was one woman, she wrote great blogs for us, and she just posted the other day, she's got 33 days clean. I was like, hell yeah. And I applaud her for doing that because she had like 2 years clean and she had a blog on our website. She was doing great. And we kind of fell out of touch is the reason why she doesn't really do stuff for us now. And she's doing her own thing. And sometimes I feel like we can put too much pressure on different people because I think a lot of that, she was like, oh, I got to write another blog today. It didn't become what it started out as is I'm going to write every single day is what she said at first. And then I was like, oh my God, every day? Like, it sounds good. But after a while, I was like, hey, you don't need to do it every day. You just, if you're feeling some kind of way, just put something out there. But I didn't want to overwhelm her with that either, like, oh, I got to do this too, and I got to do this. And she was all over the place at one point, working 2-3 jobs, and I just didn't want to like overwhelm her. So, but I'm proud of her, for getting back up and putting it out there. And some people will laugh and go, told you she wouldn't make it. More people probably do that than are going to pat her on the back. But she's got to do what she needs to do for herself. And to be honest with it, she could hide it. She didn't have to tell anybody, but it's just one of those things where once you do put it out there and you get back up and dust yourself off and move forward. But I don't know. I'm really glad that I had John today though, Casey. How do you say it? You said it so fast. What was it?
Casey Arriaga. Yeah. It's pronounced in the Spanish style with the 2 L's being pronounced like a Y. It's actually a Basque name of all things. But it's, I always tell people you could just ignore the L's and they'll go away. So just say it. Say it without the L's. It works just as well.
And Addiction and the Family is your podcast. Your first book, Realistic Hope, is out now, right? $17.99 on Amazon. Would you say if somebody wants to buy it, Amazon's the best way? Do they go through your website?
Amazon, yeah, I don't do any kind of direct sales myself. Like I don't sell books and mail them out. So that's through Amazon, Barnes and Noble, the usual suspects. Yeah, absolutely. And that's out in electronic, like Kindle, and paperback form. And same thing with the second book, Spirituality, for people who hate spirituality, out as electronic or paperback. Same sort of thing. Find it in the same places.
Do you know if it's on Audible?
It is not. I started recording the audiobook for Realistic Hope. It's a big undertaking recording an audiobook, because it turns out, especially as you're writing another book, publicizing books, and working full time. So that's a long, slow project. One of these days it'll be done. People do occasionally ask, but for the moment it's just something you actually have to read with your eyes.
I think that more people should use like a Southern accent when they're reading the books.
Well,
I'll do it
if
for
that's
free.
what it called for, I would totally do it.
Casey,
Or
I'll do it.
Had a Southern accent.
Do it for free, man. Sometimes I lose it every once in a while, but it's free.
I appreciate the offer.
I understand why you probably wouldn't want to take me up on this. Sometimes free isn't always the best option. It would be interesting, though. But, I did want to ask you, too. Now, you do the podcast with your wife, right?
I do, yes.
And you guys do, once a week, once a month?
We do a monthly podcast.
Okay,
Like I said, all the other stuff going on once a month is plenty. But yeah, we do a monthly podcast, my wife and I together, which seems fitting for something called Addiction and the Family. We're both in recovery. We're both in family recovery and our own recovery from addiction. We have a young adult daughter who has not gone into addiction. Yay! Has some mental health stuff, but certainly has been on this, portion of this journey with us. She was 2 when I got sober.
Wow.
And my wife got into recovery 3 years later. Initially, I mean, like, direct impact, again, I wasn't like driving drunk with her in the car, stuff like that, but definitely emotionally nowhere near as present as I might have been for those first couple of years. And there's some regret there, but she will look me in the eye today at 26 years old and say, "You're so much of a better father. You worked on it. And, basically you learned how to do this right." And that, a little choked up just saying that. That means the world to me. That's better than any sobriety chip, is just hearing your kids say, "Yeah, you turned it around and you're doing it right."
And what a great example to set, like, she doesn't have to be perfect. Nobody's perfect, but to know, like, hey, I can change some things, that's huge. And what an inspiration for your children. That's great, Casey. I'm really glad that we got a chance to talk today. I thought I'd have a ride. I thought we weren't going to be able to work it out, but God was like, no, I really want you to do this today. So it all worked out. But yeah, I had to ask you about that because my wife, like, we do the podcast at night usually, and she's going back to get her master's. She's going to be in social work. So
nice. Social Workers Unite.
Yep. She's cramming it all in. She'll graduate this summer because she graduated with her bachelor's from Michigan State, like back in 2001, 2002. So she put it on hold for a little bit and started wanting to go back and started trying to finish it up. But addiction kind of took her out of that. But now she's got 3 years. So she's on her way and she's going to finish up. So, but and she works full time at a treatment center, running sober living homes, 5 of them. So there's always something going on. And then you got me, "Hey honey," at 10 o'clock, she's like ready to hit the hay. And I'm like, "Oh, and we got to do a podcast tonight." And she just like gives me the stare of, "I'm going to stab you in the face." Because we used to do 4 a week and now we only do 3 a week. But every time it's like, "Honey," sometimes I have to wake her up. And I feel like the punch is going to be thrown one day. "Oh, I thought I was having a dream," whap, and just punch me in the face. But she's stressed out a lot, and I try not to put too much on her. But I know that she really enjoys doing it for the most part. But I was just wondering, when she hears that you guys do one once a month, I think she's going to be like, "Honey, how many do you want to have?" Because, like we have a lot of episodes, from like when I started, I had like 90 Days Clean. So like you can hear all that and you can go back and listen to all that. But I think for her, like, I just hope I'm not overwhelming her. But I guess you guys do one a month, so I can't say, "Hey, are you guys overwhelmed?" Which, I mean, hey, one a month is still, like, to do it right, to sit down, to have it planned, guest on, whatever. It takes a lot.
Yeah, and there's been a couple times where Kira's just, my wife is just like, "Hey, you take this one." Like I think the one I'm doing for put out at the end of this month, we usually put out the last week of the month, and so this month's episode, she's got enough stuff going on where I think I'm just doing this one. It's all good. I'll just sit down and record it. And I'm doing one on spirituality and recovery. Of course, I'm reading a lot of excerpts out of the book and stuff like that. And it's funny because it was her idea to do the episode. She was like, "Dude, you got this book, of course, you got to do a spirituality one." All that. I'm like, "Oh, cool. Hey, we'll do it together." And she's like, "Well," I'm like, "Okay, it's good. I got this one."
Yeah, that's what you got to do sometimes. But it's great to see another couple in recovery have a podcast. I love it, man. I love what you've had to say today. I'm glad that you came on the podcast. I'm glad we can make it work out.
Me too.
And I'm going to get your book, and it's going to go for a lot of gifts, a lot of Christmas gifts.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I'm really interested in it, man. You said some really, really great things, and I'm just glad that we could connect, and that the email that I got, I think, and just I'm glad that I responded. You know, it's one of those things where you get busy, you get caught up, and sometimes you probably go through this all the time, and you're like, oh, I'm going to get to that, and then something comes up, and then a month later you're like, oh, I never answered that email, and then you're flying back through.
I've got someone who's going to come on the show where I think they emailed in April, and I responded in like July or August, and which makes me feel okay because I sent a lot of messages out to people saying like, hey, you know what, your podcast seems a good fit if you've been having me on, and I don't hear anything back. And my first thought was like, oh well. And I thought, it took me like 4 to 6 months to answer an email. Sometimes it'll take whatever it takes, man. It's all good. So yeah, for sure. And hey, I want to wish your wife all the best in her journey, and you have my contact information if there's anything I can do to help or answer questions or mentor the next person come up, and I'm more than happy to do it. I think it's one of the central missions as a social worker, and especially working in the addiction field and addiction counselor, is like helping the next people that are coming up to learn whatever we can pass along, which was the other point in the book. One of my sponsors, my main sponsor that I worked with for 20 years, said, Casey, there's going to be 3 phases of your career. There's going to be the one where you're learning what you're doing. There's going to be the second phase is where you get really good at doing it, and the third phase is where you pass along what you've learned to the next people coming up. So anything I can ever do to help anybody, especially having had this conversation, just let me know, and don't hesitate to reach out.
Cool. I won't. I won't hesitate at all. All right, Casey, thanks again. Check out Casey's podcast, Addiction and the Family, and we'll put links to your podcast, to your page, and to your books in our comments, details, whatever section of the podcast, whatever format people listen on.
Yeah.
There'll be a link, so look for it there. And we'll put you on our website too, 217recovery.com. I'll put a link to your stuff as well.
That. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks again, Casey, and have a good rest of your day, man.
Thanks, you too. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the 217 Recovery Podcast. For more episodes plus bonus features, download the 217 Recovery app and support recovery by rating us in the App Store.